Hello, everybody. This is Dan Levinson, and we are back again for another episode of the Oral Talmud with B'nai Lappi, my friend and co-host, and our guest today. This is one of those every other weeks when we have a guest, and our guest today is Barry Wimpfheimer. He is a associate professor of religious studies and the director of undergraduate studies in the religious studies department at Northwestern University. And he is also the author of a book that came out not too long ago called The Talmud, a Biography, which is published by Princeton University Press. It's part of a series of biographies of important books in various religions. Most recently, we've been talking to Vanessa Oakes, who published a biography of the Passover Haggadah. And so there's a number of these books out, and Barry's book is about the Talmud. So that's obviously the hook here for having you on early on, Barry. And you're also the author of another book called Narrating the Law, a Poetics of Talmudic Legal Stories. B'nai owns these books. I think that the Talmud, a biography, is quite affordable, and Narrating the Law is an academic book. I think it's a little higher price, if I recall, but I don't know. I don't
Yes,
remember.
but because of COVID-19, Penn University of Pennsylvania Press is giving away all their books for free, like digitally right now. So if people want to read Narrating the Law, they can read it for free.
Wow.
Fantastic. So so anyway, Barry, welcome. We're so thrilled to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here, and I love the comic book font on the introductory slide. I've spoken to both of you in the past, and I'm looking forward to a lively conversation.
Yeah, we're really excited. So, I think that we're still trying to kind of feel our way to figure out the best way to do a Talmud podcast that's both introductory and also really works for people who know a lot about the Talmud. So what we've been doing is exploring every other week. We've been exploring certain texts that at least B'nai and I consider foundational and important in the times in which we live. And we've been trying to explore those on both a introductory level and also on a deeper exploratory level. And then we've thought to have on alternating weeks a scholar or somebody whose life's work is really engaged with the Talmud to try to understand a little more from either historical or other perspectives what this book is really about and what it is and what it's for, and what it maybe those are questions that are too simplistic because they've had changing answers over time. And so your book, I think I love the idea. I know it wasn't your invention because there's a series that invited you to write it in the form of a biography, but I think it's really interesting to explore the idea of a biography of a book. And so your book starts out with essentially the birth of the Talmud, but I actually wanted to start out with talking about the Talmud in, let's say, the vigor of its youth or the vigor of its adult achievement, and to just ask you to frame a little bit, to talk a little bit about what is the Talmud from the point of view of, well, what did it achieve in its life?
When I was writing the book, I really wanted to embrace the conceit of the book, the conceit of the series. So you mentioned that there is this series, and you mentioned that that I'm writing the idea to do the biography actually comes from the conceit of the series. But I really embraced the conceit of this series because it allowed me to get out of some of the limitations of the way academics think about the Talmud. So even the very idea of talking about the Talmud outside of its life in late antiquity would be something that for academics is a controversial move. But because I'm operating within a series where this biography is a kind of expectation of what you're going to get when you're talking about the Talmud, it freed me up to talk a little bit about different stages in the Talmud's life, different stages in its development. If you wanted to talk about the mature Talmud and its contribution, the mature Talmud, which you could talk about the Talmud being mature in 900 CE. You could talk about it being mature in 1500, or you could talk about the Talmud being mature today. It's just hard to figure out when the mature Talmud is. And that's why I at some point in the book, I refer to the Talmud's golden old age,
Mm.
And I was a little reluctant to use this terminology because who knows if it's the golden old age. This could be, the midlife period of the Talmud. We have no idea where we are, historically. But I'd say that the Talmud as a mature work was the foundation for the repackaging of Judaism that the rabbis who produced rabbinic literature, including the Talmud, are responsible for. The process for how that happened is far more complicated. It wasn't just, someone wrote a book and everyone in the world was instantly attracted to it and said, oh, this is the new Judaism, and now we know what to do. The various processes from how it became the most important text to how it was read and the ways that it became normative and how its normativity was filtered in various ways, all of that were very complicated, and my book tries to illustrate that in a variety of ways. But it's very clear that at a certain point in Jewish history, let's say by the 12th century or so, the Talmud was the foundational work for Jewish religious practice. So what is the Talmud's contribution? The Talmud is foundational for Jewish religious practice, and at the same time, it was functioning and continues to function as the scholastic playground of the intellectual elite of the religion. So it remains the case that if you're going to be trained to be a Jewish professional leader, most of whom historically have been rabbis, that the primary training for that is going to be in Talmud. And even though, and that's one of the things I try to point out in my book, that despite the various ways in which the modern period and Jewish opportunities in light of emancipation change Jewish relationships with tradition and change Jewish relationships with traditional community, the centrality of the Talmud as a scholastic text doesn't disappear. It just kind of gets altered. And so different factions and groups might reject or resist the Talmud's centrality or its unique claim to normativity when they're trying to establish themselves. So I talk about Reform Judaism, and I talk about feminism and Zionism, and all these groups have an initial inclination to say, oh, the Talmud, that's old Judaism, that's traditional Judaism. Let's push that away as part of establishing ourselves. And ironically, though, once they become established, they go back, they rediscover, and they reclaim the Talmud and reinterpret it. And that's a fascinating thing that's been going on. And I think B'nai and her story and her yeshiva is part of that story. It's not particularly unique to this. I think it's a particularly modern aspect of what's going on with the Talmud. So if you want to talk about what the Talmud is as a mature, I'd say the Talmud is the foundation for Jewish religious practice. It's the foundation for Jewish behaviors and also Jewish theology and ideas. It's also the central playground intellectually for scholars. And it's been core in terms of crafting people's identity. And that's I think part of why communities find it and reclaim it, because its style is so unique in that it encourages new voices to find it and reinterpret it, that it's very flexible, and it allows people to simultaneously connect with tradition while making it their own.
Could I ask you one more biography question, and then which is I think a little bit about the Talmud as like I guess I'm wondering whether it's the story of a guy, a woman who trained as an artist and then somehow found themselves as the CEO, or is it the story of somebody who always wanted to be the CEO and went to business school and achieved their goal, and so I guess I'm sort of wondering the people who, so let's say, put the Talmud into its final form, or let's say sort of the people who are kind of operating late in the game, like, would they have imagined that we're using the Talmud, or that the Talmud would have been used the way it was for the 1,000 years that followed? Is that what they were trying to achieve, or were they trying to achieve something else?
So to use your, to follow your lead and use contemporary buzz speak, I'd say one way of thinking about the rabbis who produced the Talmud is they had a fake it till you make it approach. They were acting as though they were in charge of Judaism and all Jews, and they were articulating visions for institutions, often hiding the fact that these were not real historical institutions. And then over the course of time, Judaism kind of grew into those institutions and inhabited those fantasy structures that the rabbis had created. So would the historical rabbis have been able to, anticipate this kind of success? Maybe in their wildest dreams, but it's kind of like the famous Talmudic passage of the time-traveling Moses, who finds himself in the 2nd century scholar Rabbi Akiva's study hall and hears Rabbi Akiva's interpretation and says, and can't follow because it's nothing like what Moses heard from God at Sinai. And but then when Akiva says, and all of this we learned from Moses at Sinai, that is somehow satisfying to Moses, right? So that's the rabbi's own acknowledgement that what they're doing is something of a distortion to the past, even though it's very loyal in other ways to the past. I think the rabbis probably, if they could be the time-traveling Moses and come to our study halls, they might have that experience of not recognizing what has happened with their work, but I think there would be a glint of recognition.
I very much relate to the fake it till you make it phenomenon. I think when I started Smara, it was, a fantasy that this would ever grow up and be a real yeshiva, sort of like Pinocchio. And there was a lot of smoke and mirrors at the beginning. And I very much, that resonates with me a lot. You put out a dream or a glint of a dream, and then it becomes a dream and it becomes bigger than you ever imagined. And I wanted to ask you about what you discuss in your book, Talmud, a biography, that there are registers of the Talmud, that there are actually 3 Talmuds, the essential Talmud, the enhanced Talmud, and the emblematic Talmud. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think in order to talk about that, I probably should, I find it effective to talk a little bit about my own biography, just a little. I started studying Talmud as a young child. I grew up in an Orthodox family with a pretty rigorous Orthodox day school education, kind of on the border between modern and ultra-Orthodox. My family is German Jewish, so we're kind of on the border of modern and ultra-Orthodox. So from an early age, I studied Talmud immersively, and I learned very early how to read the text, how to be fluent in its combination of Hebrew and Aramaic, how to go back and forth between the central text and the commentaries to think of them in light of each other. And it didn't really speak to me very much, even though I was capable of doing it. And then all through high school, I was in advanced Talmud classes at Yeshiva University's high school. And because we were advanced in Talmud, that meant we didn't study Bible. Like if you were advanced in Talmud, you skipped the Bible section, you spent more time on Talmud. And I did not find the Talmud all that satisfying. In retrospect, I can say that a lot of what I didn't like about the Talmud is that when you're studying Talmud in typical traditional settings, you're studying what is essentially an intellectual puzzle, a set of questions and complications, contradictions, but historically they don't make sense. You might be studying a contradiction within the text itself, but you're just as likely to talk about a contradiction between a 14th century source and a 19th century source, or between a North African source and a German source who wouldn't have known each other. And the other piece of it is that you're also likely to not carry over a creative distinction that you made in day 1 to day 2. So the creativity is the thing that's being promoted. Creative approaches to resolving contradictions and problems. The more creative you can be, the more lauded you are. And I didn't find it intellectually satisfying because I didn't understand how it was working. And then when I was in yeshiva in Israel, I encountered a teacher who, without my realizing it, started to teach me in a more historical way. I started to look at the Talmud and pay attention to which material in the Talmud was Tanaitic, with early rabbis, which was Amoraic, the later rabbis, the pre-Mishnah and the post-Mishnah, to start looking at parallel texts to help understand the Babylonian Talmud, Palestinian Talmud, Midrash. And then furthermore, when studying the commentaries, to pay attention to where the commentaries were from and what their intellectual relationships were with each other, what their styles and methods were. And this kind of historically sensitive work allows you to build, so that you're building on day 3 what happened on day 2 and day 1. And this spoke to me greatly. And this is how I became really obsessed with Talmud. I became because I found it incredibly satisfying intellectually to start building these massive logical puzzles where you're understanding and really appreciating. I had never really appreciated how the medieval interpreters of this material are tremendous. They're great readers. They're fantastic readers. They may be creative, but they're also very good close examiners of the text. And that's a tough combination. And I had not found that many of the modern creative interpreters that I had been exposed to were very good readers. They were very good modern creators, but it didn't really map back onto the text. And so suddenly I had this new methodology, which was very responsible to the original wording of the text and allowed me to build in this way. Fast forward, I come back from yeshiva in Israel, and I find myself again at Yeshiva University in a more traditional setting. And there was a lot of friction between the way I wanted to study and the way I was being taught. And that led to, I did college at Columbia, but I was attending classes at yeshiva at the same time. And they were nice enough to let me sit in on classes. And then I went back to Israel for a year, and then I came back and I did rabbinical school at yeshiva. So I was at yeshiva for an additional 4 years beyond my 3 years in college. So I spent 7 years at yeshiva and Yeshiva University in New York. And during that time, there was a lot of friction between my historical way of doing things and the way that most of the people in the yeshiva do it, which is the kind of traditional. It's dominated by what's called the Brisker approach to study, which is an approach to learning invented by Chaim Soloveitchik, the late Chaim Soloveitchik in the 19th century. And it's very bold and it's very creative, but it's not very historically sound. So Chaim Brisker wrote a book that's all about pointing out where Maimonides contradicts the Tosafists and coming up with creative solutions to how to resolve that they're really not disagreeing with each other. Even though Maimonides wasn't aware of the Tosafists weren't aware of Maimonides. So from a historical perspective, there's really no point to that contradiction. But anyway, that's what they do. And I found myself at a point in time, at an age where the fight about the meaning of the Talmud was a fight to the death about the truth of the text. And I had my historical approach, and others around me had this ahistorical approach, and we were fighting tooth and nail, and it was not fun. It was very uncomfortable. It led to things like the censorship of an article that I wrote. It led to like real friction and real tension. I wasn't the only one doing my kind of thing, but those of us who were inclined in that direction. After finishing rabbinical school, I got a PhD at Columbia with David Weiss Halivni in the religion department there. And I would still say I was still in the throes of my pitched battle over the Talmud's meaning as truth. And then I became an academic and I started teaching Talmud in places like Penn State, where I was first, and then Northwestern. Been at Northwestern now for 13 years. When gaining that distance and gaining age allowed me to create space so that I could talk about the different ways of people study Talmud and the different things they get out of it. And I began to realize that rather than thinking of it as a zero-sum game in which either I was right or the traditional approach was right, that it would be wiser to make space for both of us. And that's where I came up with the idea of different registers of meaning for the Talmud. To think of the Talmud as having my historical way of thinking about it, I termed the essential register of meaning, what the Talmud meant originally, what it meant in its historical context. And by this, I don't even just mean the Talmud itself. I also mean like medieval commentaries in their historical context. But then there's the enhanced meaning, which is what traditional readers do, where they take all of these texts and they put them as if they're in one live, vibrant, contemporaneous study hall, as if the rabbis of the Talmud are talking to rabbis today, and there isn't really that much attention paid to differences in historical context. But as I was writing the book, and I was writing with this frame in mind, some aspects of the Talmud began to make their appearance or come out and I started to think about them, I started to remember how when I was in college and I heard Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi teach a class on anti-Semitism, and he taught a class on the Paris Disputation, where the Talmud was put on trial. And I remember just having this very off experience that the Talmud he was describing was nothing like the Talmud I was devoted to and was spending my life studying. And yet it would be wrong to just dismiss that episode as a meaningless episode. It's a very important episode in Jewish history. The Talmud is put on trial, convicted, burned at the stake. I mean, this is a very big moment, and yet it's not the same register of meaning as animals goring other animals or rabbis debating theological questions. So I started to think that the Talmud is also important in a third way, beyond the two like scholastic ways that people think about the Talmud, which I had labeled the essential and the enhanced. I found that the Talmud is often used as a symbol of Jews, as a symbol of Judaism, a symbol of Jewishness. And it's both for positive and for negative. Sometimes Jews will really look to the Talmud as the central foundational text of Judaism. And so when they want to know what does Judaism mean about something, they'll look to the Talmud, even though the Talmud is one iteration of a particular version of Judaism. But often non-Jews will also turn to the Talmud as that representative. So that's when I came up with this idea of the emblematic register, of this third register where the Talmud is functioning as a symbol. And often in the emblematic register, the words of the Talmud and its internal meaning are not as important as the work that's going on around it. So this is how I also explained the phenomenon that's going on in South Korea today, where they've produced hundreds of volumes of what they call the Talmud that have become something of a bestseller, not in the sense that novels become bestsellers, but in the way that Bibles become bestsellers, things that are on the persistent bestseller list. So there's a number of titles in Korea that have reached this designation. And when you look at them, they're totally odd because many of them are fusions with, pardon me, Korean Christianity and other sort of strange combinations, Confucianism and Talmud, but they're just packaged as Talmud. And some of them it's kind of clear what's going on with them. The ones that have a picture of Mark Zuckerberg on the front and say like Talmud Jewish Secrets of Business. It's pretty clear what's going on here, but I didn't want to dismiss that work as being irrelevant to the biography of the Talmud, because I think it's actually part of how the Talmud is meaningful is the way that people use the Talmud outside of the sort of internal meaning of the text. So that's how I ended up with these three registers, the three E's, as I call them, the essential, the enhanced, and the emblematic.
Very neat. Thank you. I have 1,000 questions, but I'm gonna toss it back to Dan.
Well,
Okay.
I actually want to pick up on one thing as I was listening to you, and I'm also kind of making a connection to something Benay and I were talking about last week, somewhat on the air and somewhat off the air, which is almost like thinking about those three registers, but within the first register, meaning within the history of the Talmud, the actual history of the Talmud. We know that there were many waves, let's say. The Talmud describes certain time periods where there were, important rabbis that were often set up as rivals to each other, and that there are these various times, and they're, I don't know exactly 50 years, 100 years apart from each other, and I'm kind of thinking about how, and then it was eventually finalized at some point. But I'm thinking about like within the history of the composition of the Talmud or the storytelling or the work that eventually became written down in the Talmud, that how did some of those registers come into play? So in particular, I'm thinking about how we were talking, Benay and I were talking through last week and the time before, the famous story of the Oven of Achnai, which is a famous story about this dispute among the earliest of the rabbis of the post Second Temple destruction period, or among the earliest. And it somehow struck me that this story is written in such a literary way, right? That these rabbis are actually symbols. Rabbi Eliezer is arguably a symbol of the old Judaism that is finally being kind of crushed and put to the side. He's excommunicated, and it struck me as, well, this could have happened historically, but it seems more reasonable that this is a story that some much later person wrote, in which these characters, who probably were historical, were given certain symbolic meaning, and then the story was written that really is about how the old Judaism was left behind and excommunicated, and we move forward, and there's tragedy and pathos there, and there's a lot of it's an amazing story read as a literary creation, and it made me start to wonder, well, who were the actual Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Joshua versus who was the Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Joshua in the imagination of maybe whoever might have composed that story in its earliest form, versus the person who may have put it into its edited form. And obviously there are more layers than that, but it feels like the historical Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua are kind of in your first register. And then that second register that we might think about the later commentators actually is happening within the Talmud itself, where these characters are being redrawn and reimagined and rethought.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dan. You take the enhanced register and push it back farther than I did in the book, and push it back into the Talmud itself. You could even say the same thing even about the Bible. It's amazing because to me, as a scholar of rabbinic literature, I think of the Bible as a static text, and so because the rabbis think of the Bible as a static text and they work off of that. But one of the classes I'm teaching now is an introduction to the Hebrew Bible, so I'm not thinking of it as a static text. I'm thinking of scholarly work that claims that Miriam, that the historical Miriam may have been like a prophetess / leader of the Israelites who was not related to Moses, but the book makes her related to Moses' sister, and we find this all over the Babylonian Talmud. One of the major methodological innovations in the field of academic rabbinics over the last generation has been the study of narratives, and the study of narratives, particularly with sensitivity to the parallel versions of those narratives that are found in the different works of rabbinic literature. And English readers will definitely want to check out Jeffrey Rubenstein's various books on this topic. His first one was Talmudic Stories, but he also has Culture of the Babylonian Talmud, Stories of the Talmud. And there was one more accessible one that just came out with JPS. I forget exactly what that one was called. But part of the great work that Jeff is doing there, and he's drawing a lot on prior Israeli scholarship, most of which is available only in Hebrew. He's also drawing on the work of Shama Friedman, is sensitivity to the editorial work that's going on, that the later Babylonian Talmud anonymous voices are responsible for editing versions of the stories that they've received. So the stories of Rabbi Akiva that we know and love, about Rabbi Akiva being a shepherd and coming to Torah late in life and then going and studying Torah for 24 years because his wife after 12 years says you can go back and study for another 12 years. And so he doesn't even come in and say hi, he goes back. These are the versions that are famous are almost all the late Babylonian versions of the stories. But if you look at the parallels, you can see earlier versions of those stories in earlier, usually Palestinian works of rabbinic literature. So you have, if the late Babylonian version is coming from around 500 CE, through the use of parallels, like from the Palestinian Talmud, you can find something from 350 CE, or from Genesis Rabbah, you could find something from 400 CE, or if it's from one of the early Midrashim, it's going to be from the 3rd century CE, or from Tosefta, it'll be a little earlier. So we have this ability to do some comparative work, and that comparative work demonstrates to us that the later editors responsible for the Babylonian versions are good storytellers, and they're kind of trying to maximize the impact, the literary impact of their stories. And what I said before about Miriam, we find this a lot. The Babylonian storytellers like to take female characters and connect them to male characters. So Bruria becomes Rabbi Meir's wife, even though in the Palestinian original she's not. She's just like a Palestinian woman who is part of the rabbinic discourse and happens to be female. But the Babylonian Talmud is not so comfortable with that, so they kind of marry her off to Rabbi Meir. Almost all the female characters in Babylonian Talmud stories are connected in similar ways. Yalta becomes Rav Nachman's wife, even though in some of the versions she isn't. Right, so there's a number of things going on there. There's some anxiety on the part of the rabbinic writer about the role of women. But there's also, when you make Bruria Rabbi Meir's wife, then you can create a whole drama of Bruria's relationship with Rabbi Meir and the tension between them when you have two different participants in rabbinic discourse who might have competing opinions who are married to each other. And then you have like very interesting stories in that way. So now to get back to your specific question though about the historical Rabbi Eliezer and historical Rabbi Akiva, it was Jacob Neusner who in the beginning of the 1970s began the process of highlighting to historians that we can't trust the stories to tell the proper, true historiography of these figures. So up until the 1970s, if you read a work of Jewish historiography, the version of Rabbi Akiva that you would find, it was probably the maximal version from the Babylonian Talmud, turned into, I mean, minus the supernatural stuff. So anything that wasn't natural or was, a challenge to rationality would have been taken out. But then starting with Neusner and his students, there was a big challenge, a new skepticism emerged where now we kind of recognize that more often than not, the versions of scholars that we find in stories, if not 100% fiction, then they're at least more than 50% fictional. And a lot of, and even when Neusner's critique got absorbed, for a while still, particularly in Israel, there was still a lot of attempt to say, but there's a historical kernel here. And we can just, if we read this properly, we can recover the historical kernel. The tide's kind of turning with that even in Israel now, where there's much less attempt to recover the historical kernel. And yet, and this gets back to your specific thing about Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is a fascinating character because aspects of his character that show up in the Oven of Achnai story are consistent with his character as depicted not only in all the other narratives of Rabbi Eliezer, or most of the other narratives of Rabbi Eliezer, but also in the legal arguments that are not framed as narratives, where he takes rather extreme positions, but those positions tend to be kind of small c conservative positions that look like Second Temple sectarian positions. And so it does look like Rabbi Eliezer is consistently, he is sometimes referred to by the Babylonian Talmud by his peers as a shamuti, which is sometimes understood as like a follower of Shammai, which is one way of calling someone out as being a type of sectarian. And so Rabbi Eliezer actually has a consistent portrayal. There's some scholars that have a kind of consistent portrayal from story to story. I'd say that Rabbi Akiva also has something of a consistent portrayal when you look at, and some of Neusner's students did biographies of their, of particular rabbis, so like biography of Rabbi Akiva. So to try to like move away from some of the literary embellishments and come to some appreciation of like who a historical Rabbi Akiva is. And I don't know that you'll ever fully get to a historical picture, but you might get a better historical picture. And one of the things that's been happening with since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that there's been a nice comparative symbiosis between Dead Sea Scrolls scholars and rabbinic legal scholars teaching each other how to read their material. And so the more we read Dead Sea Scrolls law, and I'm particularly thinking of Aaron Shemesh's English book, Halacha in the Making, the more you read Dead Sea Scrolls law, the more you appreciate people like Rabbi Eliezer. And you start to see, wait a second, this Beit Shammai and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Tarfon, they have an affinity for what was going on at Qumran. They have some of the same positions. They have some of the same worldviews. And I also like to point out, because usually when people do the Oven of Achnai, I think it's because of the democratic pluralistic society that we live in. People like to make Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Gamliel, who are the majority spokespeople, they become the heroes of this story. But if you read the story fully, the story is much more ambivalent about who's the hero. The rabbis kind of get punished for what they do to Rabbi Eliezer. And I think that there's also a kind of mournful note. I think that for all of the fact that rabbinic literature does choose Hillel over Shammai pretty consistently, there is something lost when you give up on what I would say is the integrity of the Shammai or the Eliezer position. They have a certain honest integrity and commitment to a form of religious life, which they don't want to give up. And they're usually not the winners, because the winners in the story are people who are pluralists, who are willing to say, yes, like there may be some kind of pure divine way of thinking about truth, but we don't really care about that, which for us in the kind of postmodern mode is fascinating that the ancient rabbis would do that. But I kind of think what's happening with the Dead Sea Scrolls is we're beginning to appreciate more some of the qualities of Rabbi Eliezer and people like that.
Barry, I'm particularly excited about your work describing the interconnectedness between narrative and law. And as some people know, until relatively recently, the non-narrative material in the Talmud was understood to be completely separate and irrelevant to the halachic or legal material. And the narrative non-legal material was sort of taught to women, and this was not important. And you build on the work of the late Robert Cover, right? Particularly in his article Nomos and Narrative, that says no, they're intimately intertwined. And you articulate so beautifully in your first book, Narrating the Law, that the narrative, the stories of people's lives are brought in to complicate, to problematize, to add nuance, to push back sometimes against the law. And as a queer person, that really resonated, because that's what I was seeing anyway. As someone who knows what it means to have your life experience that you believe and you trust be sort of in conflict with the way the world is supposed to work. It was really rewarding to me personally to hear you talk about the role recognized by the Talmud of lived experience and how that should be pushing back, and how the Talmud models lived experience as needing to be held up against what we think, the simple answer should be. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just want to respond for a second to, I hope what I'm saying resonates with you. I remember do you remember the documentary Trembling Before God?
Sure.
Remember that documentary? And I remember walking away from that documentary, which set up this kind of opposition between religious observance and the homosexual lifestyle. And I remember walking away from that movie thinking, like, I get why the filmmakers made the choices they made. They set up basically an elemental clash between the two, the unreconcilable, the irreconcilable, and they kind of got people on camera who would represent this impossible divide that you're ever going to bridge. But I walked away thinking, isn't it more interesting to find people who are bridging that divide and to talk about how queerness fundamentally changes questions of epistemology, and how like queerness should change what it means to be observant. Like it's not just that these things are in some kind of binary oppositions and irresolvable, but it's much more interesting to think about how ways of being in the world change ways of thinking in the world.
And the fact that there's a historical precedent that's how the system has always worked, right?
Well, so I don't know that I came to that right away, but one of the things that I was really happy to be able to do with the stories I was looking at in Narrating the Law was I think it's a much more compelling argument when you can make the claim that you're not just making the claim as a postmodern reader, right, that I'm going to go back and read them in this way, but you're making the claim that like they should have been read this way all along, that historically this is how they were designed to be read, and it's just because of accumulated hermeneutics and frameworks that have built up over time, which are related to certain kinds of communal structures and normative needs, that halakha and agadah came to be the way they are. But actually go back to the text, peel away all of those apparati, and just read it the way it presents itself to you. And it's presenting it as, it's not simply, the example that I used, I think, to open up that book is the example of drinking on Purim, where the text tells you you have to drink on Purim until you don't know who's Mordechai, who's Esther, who's Mordechai, who's Haman, who's Esther, who's Vashti, right? You have to know the difference. You can't know the difference. And then immediately it tells a story about two rabbis who get drunk and one kills the other one. And then the next year, he somehow miraculously brings him back to life. And then the next year he invites him over again, and the rabbi says, no thanks, miracles don't happen every day. And what I tried to point out is, like, even if you look at the text, it's hard to figure out what the text is asking the reader to understand from a normative perspective, because that opening text says, you got to get drunk. And then the second text really complicates that notion of you have to get drunk with this very problematic story, which cuts down its problematic nature with some humor. So maybe it's parodying itself. But then I showed how even in the history of halakha and Jewish law over the course of history, various readers notice this problem. It's not something that I, the 21st century reader, am noticing for the first time. This is something that has been noticed and dealt with, but it's been dealt with in very specific ways. And so what I try to do is I try to say, well, let's not privilege the normative structure and read everything in light of the normative structures of the law code and Mishnah style text. Let's allow the stories to breathe. Let's allow the stories. And what would happen, and this is where, I mean, you mentioned Robert Cover, but in this part of the book, I'm more influenced by the Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, who came up with what he called a prosaics, which is he basically said, when you use the word poetics, you're privileging poetry over prose. You're basically assuming that what good literature is poetry. And so all prose is going to be bad poetry by comparison. So if you wanted to value the novel, as Bakhtin did, you had to create a prosaics, where you're actually coming at it from the perspective that the prose writing of the novel is the ideal. And that's kind of what I was doing with my stories. I said, if you're gonna approach these stories and ask them to participate in the halachic register by turning them into legal statements saying drink wine or don't drink wine, then they're not going to work very well. They're very poor texts. They're not. But if you flip it around and you allow the stories to be the structure in which you see everything, then you can make space for the normative legal statements without privileging them. And now you have a conversation that goes across different registers. It incorporates the legal, but it incorporates lots of different aspects of culture, including power dynamics and sociology, emotional register, right? So in some of the stories there, I get into like Freudian interpretations of what's going on with the emotional life of the characters. I get into Bourdieuian interpretations of the sociological framework of the community, right? So I'm trying to basically privilege frameworks other than the law, while at the same time recognizing that these are legal texts and they do demand some kind of response in practice. And so not ignoring that, but also sort of incorporating that into the conversation.
Thank you. And I particularly loved your treatment of the lovesick man in relationship to the halachic claims of pikuach nefesh. You save a life no matter what, with these three exceptions. And here comes this story of a man whose life we choose not to save, in spite of the fact that the three exceptions to that rule aren't in place. I just thought that was stunning.
Say more about that.
Yeah, will you talk more about that?
Sure.
That story and the relationship of that to the notion of pikuach nefesh.
One of the most famous passages of the Talmud is the passage that talks about the three cardinal sins, for which the expectation is that if you were in a situation where you were asked to choose between the law and your life, that you would give up your life. And those three cardinal sins are homicide, adultery, and idolatry. Right? So if anyone put a gun to your head and said, kill someone, you're basically supposed to allow yourself to get killed. You're not allowed to do that. Adultery, similar scenario, the biblical definition of adultery is a man having sex with a married woman, right? So we won't get into the certain issues that come out of that, but, and then the idolatry is sort of pagan, iconic worship of a deity. So the Talmud's in Tractate Sanhedrin has a whole treatment of this. It goes on for several pages. And at the end of this treatment, it tells a story of a lovesick man, a man who is so besotted with a woman that he must have her, and he's dying from his lovesickness. And so he approaches, the way the story is set up, there are doctors and there are rabbis. And so the doctors are giving prescriptions about what he can do. And they start out with they should have sex, which the rabbis say, for sure no. But slowly they ratchet it down so that the final level is the doctors say, he should have a conversation with her over a barrier, right? So picture some kind of mechitza, right? And they're having a conversation. And the rabbinic voice says, no, he has to die. Let him die and not have this conversation with her.
That's the premise of the story, right? That
Yeah,
if he doesn't have sex with her, he's going to die. Now,
yes.
What are we going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And then there is later Amoraic voices, and the anonymous Talmud itself kind of weigh in on trying to figure out why the rabbis made this decision. For starters, it's not even clear that the woman is a married woman. It's actually the simple reading of the text is that she's not. So even the first level of actual intercourse is not something that would rise to the level of a cardinal sin according to the normative passage that we just completed in the Talmud. What I tried to show is that in this story, the rabbis are really, the story is about rabbinic authority and rabbinic power. They are staging a rabbinic power that goes beyond the letter of the law. So they are specifically setting up a scenario in which the expectation is that something would be permitted by the rabbis.
In order to save this guy's life.
In order to save this guy's life. But the rabbis refuse to do it. And in that moment, they are basically arrogating to themselves the power over this man's life. One of the reasons why I find this story very helpful is that I have found, particularly in the modern period, that there is a way in which discourse of halakha, discourse of Jewish law more generally, but even modern halakha, sometimes there's a failure or a disconnect between what the halakha advocates and what the people who interpret the halakha are saying, as if to say, I'm not responsible for what I'm saying. I am operating within this system, within this discourse. It's not me, it's what I've inherited from my tradition. And what I found in this text is that you go back to the earliest part of this tradition, and you can see that there's actual people here who are pulling the levers of this and going beyond the level of the law in order to use, instead of thinking of myself as a servant to the law, and I'm just the vehicle through which the law's power and authority gets expressed, it's actually the other way around, where the law becomes the thing that empowers me. And I find it, therefore, a very kind of a cautionary tale. This is something that rabbis should be aware of, that the rabbis of the Talmud are themselves going beyond their own recommendations and expectations. So I mean, this is where, I mean, one of the things that I've tried to do in all of my work on Jewish law is to try to contextualize the legal and connect it to legal subjects. So in a piece that I wrote that came out in a festschrift for Daniel Boyarin, I talk about legal theorists and the way they think about legal theory in light of the legal subject. So for a long time, legal theorists, and this is very popular in the field of halakha, particularly the thought of Ronald Dworkin, very popular in the field of halakha, because Dworkin thinks of the judge as someone who is kind of empowered, but embodies this system of law that comes before, but isn't really free to deviate. His famous metaphor is the metaphor of the chain novel. And that, so the judge is the person writing the last chapter in a novel that previous people have drafted. And that is, I think, a view that has become popular for people thinking about legal theory and halakha, because it's one that I think is very popular among certain halachic practitioners to think of halakha this way. And I would like people to recognize that that's not actually how any legal system works, that there's always subjectivity involved, and that the legal subject, and subjectivity in a number of ways. Law operates, when it's a practiced law, it operates on and through subjects, and particularly in Jewish law, when you're talking about actual lived practices, right? So the legal subjects are the ones who inhabit and embody and actualize some of these ideas. But in addition to that, at the level of adjudication, of judgment, or even at the level of legislation, these are human beings who are human subjects and have certain kind of emotional relationship with their material. So one of the stories I did in, one of the first stories I do in Narrating the Law, the first one that I actually triggered the whole project, was a story about the Amora Rava, and he's in the Beit Midrash with his own students, and he's teaching them, and his students, he's teaching them about like certain liberties that school children can take with their tutors, right? And his students then turn around and say, oh, so we can do the same thing with you because you're our teacher. And he gets so offended. He's offended by the fact that he's being analogized to a tutor, but he's also like hurt by the fact that they're trying to kind of economically take advantage of him using the law. And he lashes out at them and he says, no, it's not the same. You know, and the text says that he gets angry at them. So I find that a great example of the fact that like Rava is an emotional subject, and his emotional response to how his ego is being treated in the room implicates how he responds. And those texts become part of our tradition. And they're like, Maimonides just cites Rava as like, that's the basis for like what the law is. So at every point in history, subjectivity is a major part of law.
I think that I want to bring together a question that came from the earlier part of our conversation, but I think it really ties into what we're talking about now, because as somebody who went to law school and taught law for a number of years, I've been thinking for a long time that part of the problem of, let's say the Judaism, we tend to call it Orthodox, but the Judaism that's more plugged into using the Talmud as a source of law, and that is plugged into the idea that Judaism is a source of, or is a legal system, as opposed to some other kind of way in which we're connected, that the Jewish legal approach, the Jewish legal world, by which we tend to mean usually the rabbinic world, is impoverished by a lack of deep exploration of contemporary legal theory, right? And that yeah, you know, for somebody who never went to law school, you can say some simplistic notions of, well, this is what it says and what can we do, and this is what anybody who goes to law school understands that there are many different legal theories that can be applied to any body of law, and that there's nothing special about the Jewish legal system. Even if you believe that it's given by God, it's still subject to a variety of interpretive challenges that modern legal theory has come to elucidate and help us understand that there's not one right way necessarily to do it, and that the whole world would be much enhanced if it wasn't just selectively choosing Dworkin, but actually understanding that there's all kinds of legal theory, and we better really kind of understand it. And maybe we should have a more subtle sense of what legal theory we want to use when thinking about this. The connection that I'm making to what we were talking about earlier is that my wife and I have been doing the daily Talmud page study. We were talking about this a little bit, and what we're struck by, especially she's struck by as someone who doesn't really have any Talmud background before, is the amount of concern that there is about ritual purity, and all of this business about, if you do this, it's ritually pure, and that it's not. And it's like, what is this even about? And it kind of made me wonder if there was kind of a founder's effect of rabbinic Judaism that came from, just like you're talking about Rabbi Eliezer, and kind of this connection to Qumran, to the Essenes, and these ideas of ritual purity that were actually very important to a certain subset of Jews in the late Second Temple period. And we tend to think about, this is why I also see the difference between the historical Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbi Eliezer of myth, because I wonder, and we were talking a little bit with David Kramer about whether or not the early rabbis were radicals, and he sort of suggested that they weren't, whereas the rabbis of myth, some of them are. And I'm wondering if rather maybe there's like a founder's effect of rabbinic Judaism, that it was extremely concerned with purity. And then when we move forward a few hundred years to Rava and some of these later Amoraim, that what they're trying to do is soften these purity rules. The difference is that in our time, here's the connection. The difference is in our time, the people who have that approach where they find the halacha to be sort of oppressive, they tend to leave. They tend to leave the system. Whereas, and so therefore, those who remain in the system are attracted to the conservative contemporary legal theories that kind of justify what they're saying. And those who are more attracted to the more progressive legal theories basically say it's too much effort, let's just leave. And so the system then becomes a one-way ratchet toward increasing conservatism. And I'm wondering if that's a way to understand maybe the project of someone like Rava, or some of these folks, like I think of them as maybe people that might be in today's ultra-Orthodox world, and they're saying we don't want to leave it or we can't leave it, but we're stuck here, so we better soften it, you know. And I just sort of wonder whether, you know, any of that stuff, how that lands on you, and whether there are ways to understand some of those internal dynamics of the Talmud as some kind of, you know, weird system, you know, obsessed with purity, and then it's like a lot of people trying to figure out how to soften the impact, and not only purity but other kinds of, you know, central concerns.
Yeah, by the way, on purity, I have to give a shout out to my former colleague Mira Balberg's work on purity, where she demonstrates that the rabbinic obsession with purity, which would be different than the temple period, because in the rabbinic period there's no, in the Mishnah there's no more temple anymore, so most of purity stuff is entirely practical. But she demonstrates that purity is the way rabbis think about objects and the cultural world around them, and in so doing construct their notion of what it means to be a human being, like their idea of themselves and where the self starts and ends. And so there's a lot of stuff going on there that that probably would be more natural to our minds to have taken place in a philosophical setting, and even in the ancient world probably did take place with people like Plotinus or Neoplatonism or something like that, where it's happening in a much more explicit way. But purities is actually possibly the discourse where rabbis are constructing their notion of the self. Yeah, I mean, I totally get what you're saying. I mean, I think there's always been a kind of legalism. So the obsession with purity is not just an obsession with purity, because it's also an obsession with details of temple rituals that are not being done. But it's also, it's obsession with details of all kinds. You know, what the straps of the tefillin are going to be made out of, and you know, if you don't pray at this moment and you pray a moment later, like, does it count or not? Like, these kinds of things that the rabbis seem to pay a lot of attention to, which I mean, the late Berkeley ethnographer Alan Dundes has a book on this called The Shabbat Elevator and Other Subterfuges, I think he calls it. And he talks about these tendencies as a kind of communal OCD. You know, I don't know that I would say, I don't know that I fully agree with what you're saying, Dan. Maybe this is a kind of different version of what you're saying. I've always found that the people whose work I really respect in terms of traditional rabbis in the Talmud, traditional rabbis outside the Talmud, are people who are willing to write outside the lines, for want of a better term, right? So what I find fascinating about the later figures like Rava, you mentioned Rava. Rava is he is the most prominent rabbi of the Babylonian Talmud. His name appears more often than any other rabbi, and he is incredibly creative in what he's able to do. I mean, he at some point articulates this fascinating idea that, which as a former law professor, I'm sure you appreciate, which is he also uses very colorful language to express it, which I won't go into, but he basically says that contracts are inviolable. And so even if you contract to violate biblical ordinance, you contract something that's prohibited by the Torah, contract is still valid. And what that means is that on a metaphysical level, if you've made a financial arrangement with someone, the particular example he uses is a man who hires a prostitute. So if a man hires a prostitute, it's illegal according to biblical law, but once it's done, it's contracted. And so she owns the money. The money is hers. It is metaphysically hers because the contract is honored. Right. So that's a kind of bold move within a religious tradition, within a religious legal tradition. Or Rava regularly has like ways of thinking about retroactive realities, like using his creative legal mind to talk about how, this is the famous issue that comes up about marriage annulments. And that's not particularly a Rava one. That's just the anonymous voice of the Talmud saying, well, how could a consummated marriage be annulled if rabbinic law thinks that sex consummates marriage and is enough to produce marriage? And the rabbis say, well, he didn't act properly, so we don't act against him properly, right? And so we retroactively undo the metaphysics of the marriage, which is totally bizarre by rabbinic law because they're not supposed to be allowed to do that. But they just license themselves to do it. So that kind of coloring outside the lines has always appealed to me. And I think it's necessary when you're dealing with a kind of legal obsessive, like there is a tendency, and I think you have a great point, that nowadays many of the people who would be able to write outside the lines have just left, which probably explains, one of the things, it's rather remarkable that given how many people study Talmud at a high level right now, particularly in ultra-Orthodox yeshivas, that there isn't more creative material coming out of that world. Like there hasn't been an explosive new Talmud commentary coming out of the ultra-Orthodox world, basically since World War II. All right, that's a very long time when you have unprecedented numbers of people studying this material. And a few years ago, I interviewed someone who's an ultra-Orthodox kollel because of a piece that I was writing. And I asked him about it, and he said, yeah, because we're not interested anymore in producing Torah. And Torah knowledge is not the product. The product now is yeshiva bachrim. The product is disciplined people who are sort of in line with whatever the program is. And so because the factories have changed what they're producing, you're no longer even getting that 1 in 1,000 who's rising to this, to produce something really monumentally impressive. So I think that's also part of the modernization of Talmud study. So it's people who are, you're right, the creative people are leaving and they're not sort of staying within and fighting these things. And in addition to that, I'd say the people within are using their materials they're transforming their materials so that it's entirely about keeping people in line. People often ask me about Talmud study, and often I go out and I speak to people, and I invariably will get someone from a crowd who will come up to me and tell me about a son or a son-in-law who's gone off the deep end and now studies Talmud all day and doesn't relate to them. And I find myself this kind of cultural translator who's translating positions. And I sometimes feel like I have to defend those people because I think that there can be something really creative and cool about people who spend their lives in kollel and really try to understand the depths of the Talmud. Even though I also appreciate the other perspective that it may be that they're actually not really doing much other than internalizing other people's ideas and thoughts and kind of inheriting them.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that I really appreciated your articulation of what's not happening in yeshivas today, because it's precisely the opposite that we're trying to do at Svara.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, I'll let you say it.
No, well, I was just going to say that until there was a Svara, they had to leave the system.
Yeah.
And maybe there's ways in which they still have to leave that system, but they don't have to leave the Talmud. And so I think it's I actually think that that's an interesting way to think about Svara, and maybe whatever Svara might Beged and also places like Hadar, and whether we may see some new, I mean, maybe this is, like you say, Barry, like the next chapter in the Talmud's life, maybe it's only been middle-aged, and this next chapter is one in which they're actually there's a whole nother landscape where the Talmud is operating, and maybe.
I mean, let's be honest. The most exciting stuff that comes out on Talmud now is coming out in academic circles. It's not coming out in. It comes out, and this I don't mean specifically the English language stuff, because the Hebrew stuff is great too, like the critical commentaries that Shama Friedman and his students have produced, which are really inaccessible right now to the American audience, are tremendous. Like source critical analysis, breakdown of how Talmudic ideas evolved, like that stuff is tremendously creative. But again, it's coming out in academic settings. What's happening in Israeli modern Orthodox context is those academic settings, those academic publications are filtering back into the modern Orthodox yeshiva study. And so modern Orthodox yeshivas now routinely are aware of Friedman and Halivni's notion of periods of composition and the anonymous editors. And they're also, as was my own experience in yeshiva, they're occasionally reading things under the table that they're not, bringing out on top of the table. Halivni's commentary to the, I remember the first time I saw someone in yeshiva reading Halivni's commentary, which I had never heard of before, under the table. Fascinating stuff.
I was reading other things under the table, but
I'm sure. Also, Dan, I have to say, it's very nice that you think that most of the world is like legally trained and at the level of law professors that is aware of like the varieties of legal theory in the world. It's my experience, like,
no, I don't think that.
When judges get confirmed in the United States and we get those hearings and you get like the worst, the least intelligent versions of legal theory ever are what comes out in those congressional hearings.
Right. No, I yes, and you're right. And I don't, I'm not necessarily ascribing special fault to the halachic world, nor special praise, but I wish that it were enriched by a more nuanced ability to talk about how, that it doesn't only have to be a black or white decision. We either accept or reject this, that there are ways to accept it, in all kinds of ways, including a, let's say, extra legal approach that we might see at a place like Svara, or at a kind of different legal philosophy. Like, I'd love to see the law school version that's like a critical legal studies Talmud law school, like that would be fascinating.
I'm not sure I agree that we have an extra legal approach. Actually, what we're trying to say is this is the legal approach. This is how it's always worked. And like we're trying to peel away the way that Talmud has more recently been read to say, look at what they were doing and what they were telling us to do, I think.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I still have a list of questions that I'm dying to ask you, but
we'll have to have you on again.
Follow-up podcast, exactly.
For sure.
Can we? Because I want to talk about Rava and his role in expanding this notion of Svara. And I want to talk to you about the role of Talmudic thinking in popular culture. When I began learning Talmud, I had this profound experience of, wow, this is so familiar to me. This sounds like my kitchen table when I was a kid. This was the dinner table. And I thought to myself, my father speaks like this, but he's never read a page of Talmud in his life. And the way in which, in the world that he lived in, there was enough of a trickle down from the 1% who were learning Talmud out into the larger Jewish culture, so that, as you point out in your book, those producing American Jewish culture are really influenced by Talmud, and you get sort of the Seinfeld, analysis, micro analysis of everyday things. I want to hear more about that, but we're probably going to have to stop. Can we leave that as a cliffhanger?
Yeah, let's put a pin in that. We'll come back to that next time.
Okay, great. Dan, I'll let you have the last word.
Well, no, thank you so much for being with us, Barry. No, this is great. This is, well, the good thing about doing a podcast or whatever this is we don't have a fixed ending time, but we should end relatively on time. So we're really grateful to you for spending this time with us, and we'll definitely have another conversation. So thanks so much for being
Thank you
here.
for having me. This was great.
Barry, thank you so much.